a word that is used in modern Hebrew to mean business. So esek is business in modern Hebrew, but la'asok b'divrei Torah, to engage in the business of divrei, of words or matters of Torah, of instruction. So that is the catch-all blessing for learning. And we have done a little bit of an intro to Jewish mysticism for those of you who remember. It was about 2 months ago, actually, because the last month when we did our Jewish mysticism session, we decided to go to current events. And so this month, the current events are still salient. However, I think we've covered them a lot here. So I wanted to sort of reshift to our circulation of topics, and Jewish mysticism is one of them. I have something of a radical approach to Jewish mysticism. We had spoken last month, 2 months ago, about the fact that there are all sorts of requirements to study Kabbalah, which is the Hebrew word for Jewish mysticism, including being at least 40 years old, being male, being a ritually observant Jew. And we obviously forego those, and we have for a long time in the contemporary world. After all, in rabbinical school, I studied Jewish mysticism as well, and I was not yet 40 when I was in rabbinical school. So, and I got to study with some wonderful Jewish mystical scholars of Jewish mysticism in Israel when I was there as well. So here, what we are talking about instead is a model that I like to call, you can't be a mystic without also being a mensch. And this separates Jewish mysticism from other forms of mysticism, because unlike the word mystic, which implies for many of us in the English-speaking world, somebody who separates themselves from society, right? If I were a monastic mystic in Buddhism or in Christianity, or a Sufi mystic in Islam, although Sufism is a little bit more fuzzy in this regard, there would be some sense that I would have stepped away from normal functioning society, right? So our image, the most famous mystic in the world is probably the Dalai Lama at this point, and the Dalai Lama lives a very separate lifestyle, as do most Buddhist monks who do it for the entirety of their lives. By the way, there is a Buddhist monastic tradition that is a temporary monasticism. One can go and become a monk, regardless of whether or not one is male or female, and for a sort of a mystical journey vacation, like a break from normal life, and go and do a monastic thing. So that's, I think, in a couple of forms of Thai Buddhism, one is there are versions of that. In any event, the Jewish mystical model says we have to be a person of integrity, a mensch. To be a mensch is to be not just a person of integrity, but a reliable person, a person who is the model of humanity. And so when we say someone is a mensch, we are saying somebody fulfills the behavioral ideals of Judaism in some way. Not that they're a holy person, but that they're an extra super regular person. And so to be a mensch is to be a community model person.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Isn't mensch masculine?
It is.
Does it apply to females as well? I'm sure it does.
I apply it to everybody.
Okay.
So one of the problems with taking things from other languages, right, is that in almost any other language but English, all nouns are either masculine or feminine.
Yes.
And so mensch in Yiddish literally means man or human.
Oh.
But the connotation, right? So when my grandfather, may his memory be for a blessing, said to me, Jonathan, the most important thing in the world is to be a mensch. What he was doing was he was quoting Yiddish. He was saying, "Sie und Mensch," right? Be a human. And to be a human is really, at least in Ashkenaz, in this version, and of course we're talking about Ashkenazi Judaism here, but I think we can transform this to a general Jewish context, that when we look at moral implications in Judaism. We are looking at trying to be a functional person, to be a person who is a contributing community member. And I would say that it is impossible to do mysticism in Judaism if one is not also working to be a functioning exemplar community member. We have to work at both at the same time. I cannot be somebody who's working on a mystical path who isn't also working on an ethical path. And so from a classical Jewish perspective, that means that our rabbis, our priests, our cantors, our community leaders are meant to be fully involved in communal life, right? We don't have any tradition. Hi, Theo. We don't have any tradition that says our leaders should be aloof or non-participatory. We expect our leaders to be communal participants. Of course, we have heteronormative ways of looking at that in the past, right? That we expect a leader to be basically a person who gets married and has children and all of this sort of stuff. That's no longer the case, right? We can be a functional leader who is a single person. We can be a functional leader who doesn't have children, because we understand that society is not about cookie cutters. It's about constantly reinventing our sense of communal life. And this will take us into the mystical path, because one of the key elements of Jewish mysticism is not knowing the end of the path. That understanding the difference between what we know and what we don't know is at the boundary between life and mysticism. That is to say, to be a mystic is to search out in mystery. And mystery is where we find God, both internally and externally. Mystery is where we find connection and relationship. So from a modern philosophical perspective, right, the articulator of this would be Martin Buber, who is a 20th century Jewish philosopher and a student of Hasidism. And of course, Hasidism is a movement inspired by Jewish mysticism. And Sarah will find all of this familiar because she has followed me as a student of Art Green, who calls himself a neo-Hasid. So this all should sound very familiar to Sarah as well. When we connect profoundly with mystery, we are having a theological conversation. Whether or not that mystery is in our hearts or minds. So when I discover something new about myself, I am connecting with the mystery that allows myself to be bigger on the inside. To use a phrase from, or a thinking about this from a scientific perspective, I recently read a book by David Bohm. Actually, if you hold on a moment, I'll show it to you. I love it when my bookshelf is right next to my teaching. So this is David Bohm. I don't know if you're seeing it correctly or backwards. David Bohm, may his memory be for a blessing, was a theoretical physicist in the 20th century. He worked on the Manhattan Project. So he was both involved in the application of general relativity and quantum mechanics. The book is called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. I don't necessarily recommend it because it's a lot of math, and unless one is interested in either figuring out all the math of quantum mechanics or reading it like I did and ignoring most of it. There's another book called The Holographic Universe, I think, which is not by David Bohm, which is worth reading on this topic. But what Bohm says is very interesting. He says there is no mechanical way of explaining the human brain that explains consciousness. For all intents and purposes, he is saying that from a scientific perspective, it seems quite clear that we are greater than the sum of our parts, that there is something mysterious, something that we could call, for lack of a better word, a soul within each of us that animates the mechanical functionings of our biology. In other words, were we to replicate exactly the biochemical electrical functionings of our brain, we still cannot explain where our consciousness comes from. So this is from a scientific perspective. He's basically saying that there is no way to explain the soul and therefore explain God out of the universe. He goes on a even more interesting track. The whole point of his argument here is that every time we explain something in the physical universe, we come up against something that we can't explain. And that the understanding that we would somehow be able to come up to the next thing that we can't explain, and it would explain everything, is silly. He says that the more we understand about things, the more mystery we will find. And his example for this is what Einstein calls, I forget the exact phrase, this unexplainable phenomenon. What is it? The weird action, right? That no matter how far away from each other two particles that are entangled are, they will show similar responses to the same stimulus. So if you have two quantum entangled particles and they are on two sides of the universe, you can do one thing to one and the same impact will have on the other without any regard for the speed of flight. And so he comes up with all sorts of ways to possibly explain this, right? To come up with theoretical models that might explain this. And he says, even if one of these theoretical models proves to be true, we are still stuck with the likelihood that we will come, if we find out what moves these things across the universe, with disregarding for our current understanding of physics, we will still come up with another thing that we don't understand and we have to explain more. This understanding that we don't understand is at the heart of the humility of both engaging with ourselves, right? That there is going to be something continually beautiful and mysterious that we have to explore within ourselves, and all the more so outside of ourselves. So that when I encounter someone or something else, and I am humble in the face of it, I will be transformed by the interaction, because I understand that the people around me and the things around me are evidence of the mystery of the universe. And since I don't know what all of you know, and you don't know what I know, that if we are humble listeners and learners to all around us, we will be transformed. In my mind, at a fundamental level, there is a miracle in this. And it's not just the miracle of our consciousness, it's the miracle that allows us to speak and exchange ideas. Now, were we in the same room and we weren't already being facilitated by the miraculousness of the technology that connects us right now, and Zoom is certainly seemingly miraculous, since I don't think any of us here could engineer Zoom on our own, right? In fact, I would put it to you that there's not a single one person at Zoom who could engineer Zoom. That it is, in fact, an expression of collective brilliance. Ethel says, I'm having some sound issues. Are people having trouble hearing me?
No.
I can hear you.
Oh, so Ethel, I think it may be a connectivity issue on your side. I'm sorry. As we said, it is an imperfect miracle, this Zoom thing.
May I suggest leaving and rejoining? I realized that saying that probably out loud probably wasn't a good idea if she's having sound issues.
So Ethel, if you want, you can reboot. There, Theo says, try leaving and rejoining. In the same room with one another, what happens when we have a real conversation is miraculous. How? Well, okay, let's start with the biochemical impulse that is your thought. You think of something, and when you think of that thing, Ethel, can you hear us better now? Excellent. When you think of something, you turn something that was residual in your memory in part of your brain, and you recapture it, and we turn it into an electrical signal that is an interplay between the biochemistry and the electric matrix of our brains. And then speaking it means tapping into our muscles that allow us to speak and understand speech and turn sounds that would otherwise be random into something vocalized. And then if I'm in the room listening to you, I do the same thing in reverse. Only remember, what's the medium for speech? The medium for speech is the vibration of the air between us. And my ear is picking up what you have said in those vibrations, decoding it into a language that I theoretically understand. And then if I'm listening closely and well, what started as an electrobiochemical impulse in your memory changes the biology of my brain. Because if I've learned something and I now remember it, I now have added something physical to my brain. If that's not enough to convince any of us that there is something miraculous just by having a conversation, that this idea that we only change our mind when we want to, right? Oh, I was resolved, but I changed my mind. No, we change our mind every time we listen to someone else and remember something new. We physically change our minds. So with this as a backdrop, one can say that Jewish mysticism is a Jewish methodology to begin to help us figure out how to explore mystery better together. And as such, we have come up with a whole host of schemas, of plans, of methodologies. And one of the big caveats, and I'm going to repeat it over and over again, no matter how often we do this, is that the key to Jewish mysticism is to not mistake it for a description of our inner lives or the metaphysical. We are not making a theological statement by saying in anything of this, right? We are not saying God looks this way. We are not saying heaven looks this way. We are not saying my inner life must conform to these methods or these steps. Rather, what we are saying is here's something that worked once for somebody, and it worked well enough that they wrote about it, and they used it as a practice. And as a practice, they found it effective. And so this very interestingly makes Jewish mysticism much more like psychology than theology. Because instead, what they are saying is, in the same way that we would say now that transcendental meditation has a physiological effect, right? Today we know that if we sit and breathe and do some particularly appropriate meditative techniques, which are very easy to learn and very hard to turn into a practice, we can lower our blood pressure, we can lower our stress hormone reactions, and therefore turn our health better. That we know that an emotional well-being, health well-being practice turns us into allows us to do a mental practice that has a physical effect on us. This is no longer a radical idea. And that's very interesting. So when we look at Jewish mysticism, we're going to talk about on a number of levels. One, we're going to talk about practices. We're going to talk about things that may or may not help us to explore mystery. And two, we're going to talk about the stories and the language and the sort of background text that helps us think about those practices in a way that might help us uniquely internalize them and use them for ourselves. So, and I want to make that slight distinction a little bit firmer. A practice is going to be, this might help us breathe this way or focus our attention in this way. Most of the things that people find confusing about Jewish mysticism are arcane practitioner recommendations, right? So we're going to come up with a 10 Sfirot model. Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but if I weren't somebody who studied it regularly, it would be difficult for me to come up with the 10 commandments off the top of my head, right? A model of a top 10 things to do is a little bit harder to integrate into our normal practice. So the whole idea that I would start with a to-do list of 10 things and try to explain them all and expect any of us to come away with it with something substantive is crazy. That's not the way things work, right? If for all of us who have given talks or written essays before, generally speaking, what's the maximum number of points we're supposed to make in an essay? Yeah. Right? If we want to make a good talk, we come up away with 3 points. And on top of that, we repeat them 3 times. Why? Right? We introduce it and we say, I'm going to talk about these 3 things. Then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. I'm going to talk about the 3 things. And then I'm going to conclude and I'm going to say, these are the 3 things I talked about. Right? So if I were to break this down today and what we're talking about, I gave an updated intro to Jewish mysticism and practice with a lot of sort of supporting material. And then I'm talking about 2 other things, which are practice and story. And most Jewish mystical topics are going to fall into these categories. Some sort of articulation that helps us come up with a practice, and some sort of story that helps us contextualize the practice. And like every good practice, it's a lot harder to do if we don't do it, keep on repeating it. And which is why we come up with stories, because the stories help us understand them. So if I can teach a good story, then theoretically, the story will help us say, oh, here is my to-do list, remembering this story. All right, so to practice what I preach, I'm gonna tell a story. Unless anybody has any questions. Okay, so this story is a story told by one of my favorite teachers and rabbis named Mitchell Shafitz. And Mitchell Shafitz wrote a book in which the story appears called The Seventh Telling. And The Seventh Telling is a great primer on how to incorporate Jewish mystical thinking into our lives without, like, going and getting a PhD in Kabbalah or learning all that much Hebrew. So this is a story about Elisha the prophet. Elisha the prophet, as opposed to Elijah the prophet, 2 different guys. Elisha is a very, very renowned miracle worker when he makes his appearances in biblical books. However, Elisha didn't start off as a renowned miracle worker. He started off, as most of us do, as an itinerant prophet, a traveling prophet, somebody who would go to different places, and just like in places that couldn't afford full-time rabbis in the last 100 years, he would show up, and he'd show up, on sort of as a circuit prophet. And So he shows up into a town that he's visited before. And in this town is a woman who is desperately miserable. And so Elisha visits her and he says to her, "Why are you so miserable?" And she says, "All of my friends are getting married and I'm not in love with anybody. I'm not getting married. I'll never find a husband. I am totally unattractive. No one will ever want me." And forgive me for the heteronormative story, but we're talking about biblical stories. And Elisha says, "Hold on one second." And he reaches into his prophet bag, because of course, like every good prophet, he has a prophet bag. And he pulls out a primitive mirror, a piece of bronze that has been shined. And he says, "You're not unattractive. You are beautiful and you are deserving of a husband and deserving of a life together. And here, what I am going to do is I'm giving you this mirror, and I'd like you to every morning when you wake up, look in the mirror and repeat the things that I've just said to you." And she accepts the mirror with great skepticism, but nonetheless, she follows the practice. Elisha leaves town, and after a few months of doing this, she in fact reconnects with a friend from her childhood, and the two of them fall in love and they get married. And she turns to the rest of the people in the town and she says, "Look at that. See that? I was not, see what Elisha has done. He brought forward this wonderful miracle." And the townspeople says, "Shh, that wasn't a miracle. That was just self-affirmation." A couple of years pass and Elisha returns, and the woman yet again is miserable. She is terribly upset. And he says to her, "Why are you upset? You're married, you're happy, what's going on?" And she says, "Oh, all of my friends are having babies and we can't have a child." And he reaches again into his prophet bag and he pulls out a piece of parchment on which he writes some Hebrew letters, basically a quote from the book of Genesis that's saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." And he hands it to her and he says, "I don't want you to focus on the letters. I want you to focus on the blank side of this parchment. And every night before you go to sleep, I'd like you to meditate for 3 minutes on the blank side of this parchment." And she again looks at him with great skepticism, but he leaves town. She does this. And within 3 months, she is pregnant and she has a beautiful, healthy baby girl. And she says to the townspeople, "Look, Elisha did another miracle for me. Isn't it amazing?" And they say, "That was just relaxation therapy." Elisha comes back a third time to this town and finds the woman again in crisis. It turns out her daughter is very, very sick. She is on a respirator and is struggling with COVID-19. And he goes into to their home and he says, "Please leave me alone with your child and I will take care of it." And he goes in and he sits with the child and he comes back out and the child is healthy. And the woman says, "Look, it's a miracle. He healed my child from this terrible plague." And the townspeople again say, no, he just brought in an experimental therapy. Nobody had that yet, and it was no big deal. And so finally, Elisha comes back a fourth time. And the fourth time he comes back, the family is again in crisis. It turns out that the economy took a downturn and the husband lost his job. They have nothing left to eat. Unemployment checks have run out. Their rent is due and they're about to be evicted. And Elisha goes into their home and looks in the refrigerator. If you were in this state, what would you have left in your refrigerator? think of something that was be left in the refrigerator when nothing else was left.
Ketchup.
Ketchup. Excellent. So they have in the refrigerator, they have the remains of a bottle of Heinz ketchup.
Oh, come on.
And Alicia turns to them and says, turn to your friends and your families and your neighbors, have them bring every possible vessel, every barrel, every jar, everything that you can possibly think of, and bring it here. And they bring it out front to the house, and he takes the bottle of ketchup and he starts pouring the bottle of ketchup into these vessels. And out of this bottle of Heinz ketchup comes organic, healthy, tasty, zesty, absolutely vitamin-enriched ketchup that accords with everyone's diet, and that he fills all of the vessels in the town, and the household is saved because they go into the organic seasoning business. And yet again, the woman turns to the townspeople and says, look, you can't deny it. Elisha came into our town and did yet again a fourth miracle for all of us. And they said, it's just good marketing. And Elisha, who's there for this time, says, I don't understand all of you. I have come here. I've done 4 excellent miracles on behalf of this woman. I am done with you. I am a big prophet now. I'm done with the circuit riding, and I'm never coming back to this town. And he summons a flaming chariot down from the heavens, steps into the chariot, and flies away. And the woman says, see, another miracle. And the townspeople say, it was just a UFO. So there are a couple of major lessons from this story that I like to derive. Number one is all of us here have either been a child or have had children. And I can tell you that when a mother comes upon their child's room that had been messy and is no longer messy, often we say to a child when we want them to clean their room, why can't you just clean your room? And what happens if the room gets cleaned by itself? The parent says, it's a miracle. And this is the interplay between these two words. When we put the word just before something, we are taking something that is miraculous and turning it into something mundane. It was just good marketing. It is just a UFO. It is just relaxation therapy. It is just self-affirmation. It is just a new medical miracle. We live among miracles, and it is easy to downgrade them, to demote them from miraculous to normal. And what we do when we do that is we demote our own soul. When we interact with the world as if it is not miraculous, as if it is normal, we cease to embrace our own miraculousness as well. The demystifying of everything is a demystifying of ourselves too. And so that's the power of the word just. And how it works with regard to miracles. And the other thing that is introduced by this story is the 4 worlds idea. Now, I'm breaking my rule here. Instead of giving you a to-do list of 3, I'm giving you a to-do list of 4. However, there are really only 3 that we can work on. The 4 worlds idea comes from a Jewish mystical understanding of a text in Isaiah, if you can imagine, which I'm going to put up for us in a moment if I can re-find it. And this text in Isaiah is read for this purpose, to explain the four worlds that we see in Jewish mysticism, which is a lot easier to look at than 10 worlds or 10 ideas, right? So this is, there we go. And I will share this with all of you so that you can see it, but we'll also talk about it for those who may not be looking. Okay, so here it is, four worlds, a model for functioning better. So here is the quote from the book of Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 43, verse 7. Kol hanikra vishmi v'lichvodi barativ yitzartiv af asitiv. All who are called by my name and for my glory, I have created, I have formed, and even I have made. So these four ideas, glory, creation, formation, and making or doing, fall into the area of four worlds of figuring out how to do things. And they are, glory is identified as inspiration, creation is design or thinking, formation is feeling things out or emotion, and making is doing an action. And this methodology is a huge assistance in my mind in figuring out how to succeed in doing things by understanding that a doing must be balanced among these four worlds. And I use this as a model for functioning better because our story talked about these four worlds. Without inspiration, without the spark of a good idea, we cannot accomplish anything. What do I mean by that? I mean that all good ideas are, here, let's see if we can see this a little bit better if I do it this way. Here, is that bigger for everybody? Oh, here we go. Let me try it again. Sorry. Let's try it now. There we go. Okay. So if I come up with a big idea, that big idea comes from deep within me. It is the spark of doing something new and wonderful. That big idea is as close to God as I get, as close to fundamental inspiration as I get. In our story, the big idea for the woman is the idea that she is actually could be married. The idea that she was worthy of partnering. And we don't get anywhere without inspiration. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a whole lot of things that we have to do that aren't inspired. It just means that the best things that we do are also accompanied by inspiration. Look, I've got to do any number of chores, right? Today, I paid a bill, right? My paying of the bill was not an inspired thing. It was part of the mundane things that I have to do. Is there an inspired way for me to pay a bill? Probably not. But that's because this is an ideal. And we're not going to be exploring mystery in every aspect of our lives. The question is, can we explore mystery in more aspects of our lives? Can we make our actions and our existence more whole, more balanced? If I wanted to do something like build a home, however, I'm going to start with an idea of that home. Ginny and I, when we were in our 20s, used to dream about designing a house for our family. We didn't have kids yet, so we were just dreaming a lot. At the heart of that idea was the idea that the kitchen and dining area would be in the center of the home. Why? Well, clearly, because if you go into any of our homes with any sort of ethnic or cultural background, it doesn't need to be Jewish, it can be Italian, it can be Irish, it can be African American, it can be Muslim, everybody comes together around food. So the place where we gather to eat in our mind, the hearth of the home needed to be in the center somehow. So that was our idea. That was our spark. And I think that was a good spark. However, the spark isn't enough. We have to come up with a design for it. So then we end up in this creation part, right? This design or this thinking. In our minds, this in our model here for building a home, this would be the blueprint. We take this inspiration, this idea, we start laying out the way it's going to look. And a blueprint is not a fully fleshed idea. It is just the plan. Even a really well thought out blueprint, which shows both the top down, right, the aerial view, right, and the elevation, shows the side view, is still just a representation. It is where we are in our minds. It is where we go with that initial thought to begin with. That inspiration is then we start thinking about it and we start planning it. And we can think about this with any good idea that we've got. That it is, and I'm using just here, and it's funny because every time I'm using just, I'm still talking about something miraculous, right? To take an inspired idea and do more than talk about it is important. We need to come up with a plan. And so we take the inspiration and we put it down into a design, into a thought out plan. And yet the plan must be acted upon and felt out. But even before we act upon it, we've got to come up with the next layer of the plan. And the next layer of the plan is another step of creation. By the way, in Hebrew, the words for creation in this are bara and yitzar. These words in the second and third words in the created formed are things that God does. But God only does the bara. We do the yatzar, the formation. God does creation from nothing. We do it as well, but in terms of the Torah language in Hebrew, that's almost a divine thing, to take inspiration and turn it into design. We do a lot of this formation stuff, to take design and flesh it out. So for example, before we can go and build something from a blueprint, we need to figure out what materials go in. Often a blueprint doesn't tell us, are we using plaster or are we using drywall? What kind of piping are we using? What's the interior going to look like? What furniture are we going to put in and all? Suddenly, going from the thought out plan to the feeling, the forming of what goes into the plan is yet another step. And it's just as important. And finally, we go and do it. And of course, the doing is where all of that thinking and feeling and inspiration comes into play, the making, the action. What's interesting is that in my mind, a good action, a good thought, a good feeling, a good inspiration is balanced in all these worlds. It takes into account all of these ideas, that these dimensions are a way of thinking through things, feeling through things, spiritually exploring the connection between all things that allow us to do better. I'll give you an example from my own life. So another thing that happened in my 20s, I spent most of my 20s in rabbinical school, right? From the time I was 22, I went to Israel for almost a year. Until the time I was 29, I was involved in either preparing to be a rabbinical student or being a rabbinical student. So 7 years. In that time, I was convinced that one of the great things about being a rabbinical student is I could live in these upper worlds, in the worlds of inspiration and thought and a little bit of information, but mostly this was going to be sort of a mental spiritual experience. Very quickly, I discovered though, that I really didn't have enough money to be a rabbinical student, that I was running up a lot of debt, And so for a little while, Ginny, who was along for the ride with me, noticed that I was doing some really strange things. Like I was filling out all of those Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes entries. Yeah, which is not a way to find extra money. And so I was under the false impression that I could be a good student, a good practitioner of intellectual, spiritual life without taking care of the world of action. That I didn't need to have a plan that included how I was going to pay for everything. And I drove myself nuts. So much so that I thought, participating in sweepstakes was going to help me balance that out. Until I figured out a plan that allowed me to get a loan from my school and pay for things, and a plan to pay it off eventually, I couldn't participate fully in being inspired or thinking it through, because when we are stressed out about how we are going to practically do something, we are not good students of anything. We are not exploring mystery if we are worried about how to feed ourselves. We are not exploring mystery if we are worried about where rent is going to come from. If we, in any of these areas, if we are imbalanced, we don't accomplish anything. And this goes on an individual and a communal level. And again, it goes right back to this idea that in order for me to be a mystic, I need to be a highly functioning mensch. I need to be not just a good person, but one of the things about being a mensch, being a high functioning community member, is I'm not a drain on the community either. I can't be a donor of tzedakah if I am also taking all that I give back in help. Poor people are supposed to give tzedakah. We are supposed to give no matter how wealthy we are. But if we have no plan to cease being a drain on the community, then no matter how much we give, we are not fulfilling our mission to be a mensch. We have another Yiddish word for that. It's called schnorrer. Does anybody know what a schnorrer is?
Sure.
Some people are shaking your heads. So a schnorrer, I'll give you a great example of a schnorrer. This is another one of my friends from rabbinical school. One of my friends from rabbinical school was constantly struggling with money. And so he's constantly asking for favors. And I mean, everything from, dinner to a cup of coffee to some help with a loan, whatever. And everybody knew he was never going to give it back. He was a schnorrer, but the way he described it was really perfect. He said, think of me as somebody who's giving you an opportunity to do a mitzvah, to do tzedakah. And we know people like this, right? We know people who live their lives with their hand out. And this is not to say that everybody doesn't need help sometimes, because we as Jews often err on the other side of things. We often say that all Jews must be fiscally successful, and therefore if I'm not, I'm a terrible Jewish person, right? If I need help, if I have to ask for help, I'm a bad Jew. But that's not balanced either, right? And what we're looking at in these four worlds is an attempt to create some balance, some sense that if I'm not thinking through all of these areas, what am I missing? Is there some way that I can be compassionate in the world of formation as well as practical, right? Because formation is how things feel. And how things feel means I need to be giving, I need to be generous, but I also need to be thoughtful about how it's going to get done, which is more like in the design thought thing. All of these things need to be taken care of. If you can believe it, we even read Jewish text using these models. I'm going to put down this. And what do I mean by this? Well, there is a model, and actually I'm gonna type for you so that you can see it. This model takes what we're talking about, which was the four worlds, and it applies it over a different rubric. And the rubric is, how do we learn? Or more importantly, how do we read? So let's look at this. I'm gonna show you my typing screen, and then you can see. Okay, there we go. So glory and inspiration is the most difficult, the most abstract. So we don't start there. We start with the easier aspect, the making or the action. So we're going to reverse the order of these, and we're going to start with action. Action in reading is the story. What's on the surface? So if I were to talk about this week's Torah reading includes the story of Balak and Bilam. Balak is the king. Yes, this model is the way that God created. You got it, Ethel. Absolutely. We are following a narrative model of God's creation. God starts with the idea and moves through this and then does it. And that is exactly right. We are following a Genesis model. So this story, because the key in Jewish mysticism, and Ethel, you're right on topic, because this, when we do the 10 model as opposed to the 4 model, right? The 10 model is a direct attempt to understand the way God creates, so that when we create, we go backwards. We start with us, the mundane, and we move towards God, which is what we're going to do right now. Because the best way to create is the way God did, but only we don't start with the infinite. We don't start with the abstract. We start with the concrete. And that's what we're talking about with the world of action, the world in which the story happens. So this week's story, we have a king, Balak, who hires a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, Bilam, to go and curse the Israelites. And instead of cursing them, he blesses them. That's the story. In Hebrew, we call this the pshat, the surface. It's what's going on at the very basic level. And the P is important. Now, there's a whole lot going on in this story. One of the things going on in this story is that the Balaam rides a donkey on the way to go curse the Israelites. And the donkey sees an angel with a fiery sword blocking their way. And the donkey tries to stop. And Balaam beats the crap out of his donkey. And she keeps on not going forward, because to go forward and into the angel would mean death for Balaam. And so God gives the donkey voice, and the donkey says, "Hey, wait a second, why are you beating me? Haven't I always been a good donkey?" And Balaam says, yes. And then God shows Balaam the angel that's in front of him. And the thing is that in all of this, Balaam, near the end, never thanks the donkey. And so the feeling here, the emotion here, we're going to call a hint or a clue, that there's something here that requires explanation. Hint or clue in Hebrew is remez. And this is just the clue that there is something more going on. The gut feeling, right? I need I need to explain something going on here. And then we come up with a thought or a teaching. So what's the thought or the teaching about this? Even an interpretation. The thought or the teaching about this is, we know that there is a disconnect between people and animals, and that animals might be sources of great wisdom, and we never thank them for it. And so here we can have our teaching be that Balaam, who is not a Jewish thinker, but is nonetheless connected with God, is willing, because his life was in danger, to thank the angel for giving him a lesson, but never thanks God and never thanks the donkey. So Balaam is not a model for us because he is somebody who is forced into doing the right thing. And even when he's forced into doing the right thing, he never actually gets it right. And this is our drash, our interpretation. That's the Hebrew for interpretation. It's related to midrash, right? I just gave you a midrash, a story to explain the clue. So we've got 3 layers here, right? Where the action is, the action leaves us with a question, a remez, a clue, and then we come up with a teaching to explain it. And then there is inspiration. Something secret, which is the same word in Hebrew, starts with the same letter in Hebrew, a sod. Something infinite. So what's the secret at the heart of this teaching? The secret at the heart of this teaching, the inspiration at the heart of this teaching, is from another midrash, for example. Could be anything, right? Could be whatever we glean from this. There is another midrash that says, God knows what will happen in the Torah ahead of time. So that God, in fact, creates the mouth of the donkey right before the end of the 6th day of creation. Why? Because God doesn't muck around with creation after creation. All of the miracles that happen in the world are in fact preordained by God, because even God withdraws from changing the rules after creation is complete. And that God understood from the outset that Balaam would not listen to reason, would abuse his donkey, and that she would have to speak. God knew that from the beginning. And this, in my mind, gets at this wonderful idea, speaking of the mystery of creation, that inside all of creation is a mystery to be uncovered. In our very DNA, in atomic structure, in all of these things. And it may not allow us to predict the future the way God did. But the more we understand, the more likely we are to be able to anticipate the future. The more we understand, the more likely we are able to figure out what we might need and how to avoid problems. So for example, look at where we are today. We are in a present that could have been avoided had we been collectively more thoughtful, more balanced in all of these 4 worlds. Had we taken all of these things into account ahead of time, we might, as individuals and as a collective, as a society, we might have been able to do better. But we didn't. So the question is, how do we do that? And I'll throw out a different problem that I think we can do better on now. Our world is facing collective calamity from climate change. And whatever we believe the source of that is, the outcome is clear. The Arctic experienced a number of 100-degree Fahrenheit days in the last couple of weeks. The permafrost is thawing, and methane is bubbling out from up from Siberian lakes. I don't want to argue anymore about what the cause of climate change is, because we could argue that forever. But if we're going to go forward into a world where our grandchildren can live, where our children can live safely with one another, we are going to need to figure out a solution. Now, that solution may or may not be all of us quitting using gasoline engines. It may be some technological fix that we have yet to discover. But if we're going to discover it, we're going to have to put our minds together, and we're going to have to use our difficulty in the last 6 months in coping with coronavirus as an inspiration to cope better with the other crises out there. And that's my Kabbalah talk for today. Any questions or thoughts?
Thank you. That was terrific.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And please let me know if you have any other topics that you'd like us to talk about. Next week, just for example, we will be back here at the same time, same Zoom channel. And our chat on July 8th is scheduled to be current Jewish topics. So at that point, we could talk about anything. I think we might end up talking about either annexation or anti-Semitism.
Those are certainly current.
It's kind of where we are, right, Joan?
Oh, I was just gonna add, I was working on a thesis proposal the past year about comparing Holocaust education in France and the United Kingdom. So I did a lot of research into anti-Semitism in France, where I was living.
Wonderful. Well, then you would have a lot to bring to that topic if we talked anti-Semitism.
I do have a lot to say about that, yes.
Generally speaking, if I were to do anti-Semitism, I'd attempt to do a little bit of background. So we'd probably do about 30 minutes of talking about where it all comes from. And then we'd probably do about 30 minutes of talking about where we are today. So I'd love anybody's input. Obviously, where we are today, I saw a quote on Twitter this morning that kind of sums this up, which is, everybody is anti-Nazi until they have to be pro-Jew. And I think it is unfortunately a sad state of things that that is the case. So, all right. Thank you again all so much for being here. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Ethel, thank you for anticipating, although it looks like Ethel's jumped off, for anticipating where we're going next, because where we're going next is likely to be the 10 Sefirot, which will be another model for creation, and a lot easier now that we have the 4 worlds model. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, Rabbi.